Okay, shall I try it again?
Now you're working.
Okay, excellent.
Give me 1 second, I have to start.
Jai us.
You are on.
Okay.
You're on.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we're continuing with the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, explained by Paramhansa Yogananda as remembered by his disciple, Swami Kriyananda. And we are in, I believe, chapter 12 of the book. I'll just go back. Chapter 12 of the book, The Nature of Right Action. Chapter 2 of the Gita, verse 45. It's about the Gunas. It's a real good one. Well, is there a chapter in the Gita that isn't? I mean, do you ever say when you read a chapter, oh, this is one of the poorer chapters of the book? I guess you don't really. So it's a little redundant to say that. Okay, this one is about the Gunas. Like all the other chapters, it's really excellent. 245. The Vedas teach that the universe is a mixture of three basic qualities, or gunas. Your duty, Arjuna, is to free yourself from all three, as well as from the dualities of nature. The way to this achievement is to remain ever calm in the self, free from any thought of either acceptance or possession. Okay, very often in many different classes that I teach, I have to say this is a really key idea. And I actually really don't say that over and over again. There's probably a list of, I don't know if I could actually put them together, but maybe 10 or 12 really key concepts that over the many years that I've been on the spiritual path, they become my template for how to tell which way is backward and which way is forward. When I first discovered the teachings of self-realization, which was first through Swami Vivekananda, disciple of Ramakrishna Paramhansa. Vivekananda lived in the early 1900s, and Ramakrishna lived in the late 1800s, mid-late 1800s in India. Vivekananda came to America, but only for a few years. Most of his rather short life was spent in India. When I first came to these teachings, it was when someone handed me a copy of a book by Vivekananda, which was transcribed lectures, actually. And until that time, I was trying to figure out if the word seeker would actually be the right word for what I was. I wasn't conscious enough to be a seeker in the sense that I didn't know there was something to look for. I was just exceedingly anxious. Anxious about my future. I was 18 years old, almost 19 at the time the book came to me. And of the age, I had actually done 1 year of university, but had sort of simultaneously dropped out and flunked out. Flunked out because of disinclination, not because of lack of ability. But it was sort of like I'd already started and decided that college wasn't for me, and yet I honestly had no other plan for my life. I just knew lots of things that didn't work. So that's why I say it wasn't even that I was a seeker yet, except on some very intuitive level. But I felt like I was running through my options more quickly than I wanted to, which was making me feel very insecure. So when I was introduced to self-realization, the principles of Vedanta, the law of karma, a few things like that, the power of love as the antidote to fear. Fear was a big issue in my life. Just a kind of general high-strung tendency toward just being a little overwrought, even when there was nothing really to be overwrought about. And aware of the fact that I was just anxious, I was frightened, and I didn't really know how to get out of it. I knew it was detrimental, but I didn't know how to get out of it. And Vivekananda said to me in his book, it actually turns out to be a quote from, I believe, St. Paul in the Bible, "Perfect love casts out all fear." It was the first time somebody had actually spoken to the issue with something that that I recognized as profound. And Vivekananda also introduced me to the law of karma with a very simple cause and effect. What you do today will create tomorrow. What you did yesterday is created today. And the last was, don't think about yourself and you'll be happy. In other words, self-forgetfulness is the key to spiritual life. I mean, those three principles, I heard those, let me think now, 50 years ago. I've never forgotten them. And what they did for me, and this is where I was going, I was like a free-floating molecule. I was very energized and I was moving around a lot. I was bright. I was bright, in lots of different ways, enthusiastic and intelligent and privileged in many different ways. But I just was like a ping pong ball bouncing off the wall. I remember we had a room in our house where we had a ping pong table. My older brother was really an extremely creative, inventive character. He was an actor for a while and a playwright, and I think he was born for improv. And so in our house, everything that happened, he was always riffing off of it. And when we used to play ping pong there, every once in a while, because it was a closed room, some crazy wild shot would happen where the ball hits the ceiling and the wall and the door, but then actually comes over to the opponent's side of the table. And he would always insist that it was an act of superior skill and that he'd planned the whole thing and he knew what the trajectories were every time. But that was how I felt about my life, because I grew up playing ping pong. Playing ping pong badly, but I knew how that little ball was just so vulnerable to the paddle and so vulnerable to everything that it hit. And that's really how I felt like about my life. It's just like I never knew, what the angle would be that would which direction I'd bounce. And I like to be active and have a lot going on, but it was scary. That's just really the only word for it, because I could not discern what the rules were. And I couldn't even discern the rules of life, what to speak, the rules of happiness. So when Vivekananda handed me those rules of happiness, I felt, it was just like I'd been holding my breath my entire life. And for the first time, I just exhaled. There is a map, there is a way, there is somewhere someone who knows something that I really want to know. The reason I flunked out of college was I just didn't see anything there that I wanted to know. And they had a lot to tell me, but it wasn't what I wanted to know. It was just more ping pong ball stuff. At the end of it, I would be no wiser than I was at the start. Wisdom, not knowledge. That's how I've succinctly put it since. That's what I was seeking. So now, coming to all of that, over all the years of the path, perhaps because it's the way I started, I was always have always been looking for those really core concepts, the really core concepts that will constantly bring you back to reset. Maybe because I have an intense personality, and for whatever, I've had the astrologers tell me what it is in my horoscope, but I can be a little reactive. I'm just going to leave it there, and I'm going to ask none of my friends to write comments, but I can be a little reactive. And I calm down, but I am a little reactive, and therefore I can spin away from center. Emotionally or in other ways, I can spin away from center. So I've always wanted to have a really clear way of telling whether or not I was on the straight and narrow. Because one thing I really figured out is that it's just not so easy to tell. The self is extremely deceptive. I was remembering one of my very early conversations with Swamiji. This is my only excuse. It was a very early conversation. I moved to Ananda Village on June 1st of 1971. This could have actually even been in the month of June. It was certainly not later than July. And I had arrived there at the age of, just about 24. I turned 24 a few weeks after I arrived. And, but I was already pretty intense. And I was very, like everyone, I made sense to myself. That's the most amusing thing about everybody. We always make sense to ourselves. It just there's a consistent inner logic that we're following, and no matter how many gaps in that logic there may appear to people watching you from the outside, if there were, from the inside, one would behave differently. So I made a lot of sense to myself, and I followed one of those wonderful principles of life, which is if what you're doing isn't working, then do more of it. Because we're always just biased in the direction that we're inclined. Because if we weren't biased in that direction, we wouldn't be inclined that way. So I was exceedingly mental and exceedingly intellectual in my approach to things. I didn't even read autobiography until after I met Swami Kriyananda, because all the devotion and all the miracles, I was trying to be serious about the spiritual path, and so I thought you had to be austere. I didn't understand the heart. I just understood the mind. So I could tell it wasn't working, and I was sitting in front of Swami Kriyananda. He was in as I recall, he was in an armchair. I believe I was also sitting in a chair in front of him, and I'm explaining to him how I'm going to sort my life. I don't know, this always makes me laugh. I'm going to sort my life out. And I said, I think I need to improve my powers of analysis, like that. In retrospect, I'm so embarrassed. But Swamiji, I was telling this story the other night, and oftentimes, in memory, I would translate the movement of Swami's energy field into something more physical, just because most of the time people are restless, and when they have a strong energy, they move physically. Swamiji, especially when he would give interviews, would be absolutely calm. So after I said I needed to improve my powers of analysis, I'm sitting in front of him. I was really skinny. I wore my hair in these tight little braids. I had these little glasses like no one with 2 working brain cells would think I needed to improve my powers of analysis, except for me. So I said that to him, and I have this feeling that he rose out of his chair toward me, but he probably didn't. But still, that's how I feel, because I felt like all of this just came at me. And I felt like Swami, like a little vacuum cleaner, just tried to suck that thought right out of the air and maybe take it out of my brain at the same time. It was such a strong reaction. And he just said a single word, and he probably said it calmly, but I hear it quite differently. I heard him say, "No!" like that. But I think he probably said, "No." Then he said, and this I do remember, just so sweetly, "What you need is more devotion," like that. Life lesson, isn't it? Anyway, coming back to where we were, I've always been looking for ways to reset, and analysis apparently was not one of them. But if I can have certain ideas, what you do today is the result of yesterday, what you do tomorrow is the result of today. I've studied the law of karma, thought about it, observed and reflected on it every day of my life since I read that when I was 18, and meditated on the absolute inescapability of the karmic law, and stretched myself to understand that if it's true anywhere, it has to be true everywhere. There's so many parts of it. Because when you get that thought really deep inside of you, everything becomes different. Because then you can never be a victim. And nobody around you is ever treated unfairly either. And everybody is standing exactly where they need to stand with what they need to meet what they have to meet. When my parents were in their declining years, it was about a 10-year cycle. My mother had Parkinson's. Toward the very end, my father's brain became a little less functional than it had been through most of his life. Oh, when all that started, I just totally freaked out. And I ran around trying to make them respond to their situation as I would respond as if it were my situation. And they didn't appreciate that in the way that I thought they should. They didn't really welcome my totally trying to take over their life and turn it into my life. And it took me longer than it should have to read the breadcrumbs and follow the path to the fact that, this is their karma. And actual fact, they're not freaked out about it. I mean, my mother certainly wasn't happy to have Parkinson's. My father wasn't happy that she had it. It wasn't like it was easy or pleasurable, but it was their karma, and therefore there was a familiarity to it. There was a flow of energy. There was a capacity to respond to it, or at least the divine right to have the opportunity to respond to it, and no need for me to insert my point of view between themselves and their own destiny. But I mean, that's just one example. The law of karma just rescues us again and again. One might not enjoy the consequences of one's own past actions, but knowing that it's in complete divine order certainly changes one's whole relationship to it. So the law of karma is one of those. The different levels of conscious, subconscious, superconscious, and conscious, those three realities are certainly very important. The 8 manifestations of God. I'm intrigued now, you see, to see if I can enumerate them. Those are 3. There might not be 12. There might be a lot fewer than that. I mean, I'm just simplifying the path to philosophical concepts that have really worked for me. Love casts out fear is certainly one of them. And the path is not self-perfection so much as just forgetting the self altogether. Perfection of the self is no self. That was the analysis part. If I just keep analyzing what's wrong with me, then maybe I can make it not wrong with me. But the self-preoccupation was what was wrong with me. And the lack of devotion was what was wrong with me. And analysis was not going to get me any closer to that. I say wrong with me. What I mean by that is it was not happiness producing. It wasn't a sin, it was just ignorance. Now, let me just second, there's a little thought there that I wanted to catch. Well, it's elusive, so I'll come back. Our chapter today deals with another one of those concepts, which is the 3 gunas. And they're discussed in many other places in Swami Kriyananda's writing, but one really can't listen to them too often, because every time you think about it, it comes back clear again. So I'm going to just spin some of the extremely useful qualities about the 3 gunas. Okay, this is Sanatan Dharma. This is ancient wisdom, that all of creation is comprised of these 3 vibrations of energy, and they interplay with each other in a certain way that explains to us whether or not we're going forward on the spiritual path, standing still, or going backwards. That was a point that I brought up a little while ago that I never quite finished. It's that I got into the whole power of analysis thing and all of that. It's extremely hard to tell, just looking at oneself, what's really going on. We tend to fixate on small spots. If you have a white sheet and there's just certain spots on it, people tend to look sometimes. They have a whole brand new car and there's a scratch on it, and they tend to see the scratch, or a perfectly clean dress, but there's a little spot on it down here, whereas in fact, most of you and most of it is in perfect order. And to focus in on what part isn't in perfect order is not in perfect order to do that, because it makes the egoic self too important. And that preoccupation itself is the delusion. So I was starting to say, when we try to evaluate ourselves, it's just very, very difficult to do. It virtually impossible to do, because the phrase is always, we're too close to ourselves to see ourselves clearly. It's just a little thing. I'm of an age now that when I look back at pictures over the course of my life, I don't look anything like what I thought I looked like. I was just spinning through photographs through my 30s and 40s and 50s, even up into my 60s. The picture I have of what I looked like is not at all what I looked like. It was just one more reminder of how little we know ourselves. And it's not as if I hadn't seen videos and photographs all those years, it's just, life is a dream. It's really hard to see it accurately. I'm going to just give you one thing that Swami said that's such a beautiful thought for the idea of self-evaluation. He commented, he put it like this. He said, if you're going to judge yourself, and then he parenthetically said, which I don't advise doing, he said, the only way you can judge yourself is not by what you've accomplished or where you're standing now, because by definition, by the time you reach any moment in time, that moment in time is past, because time is a flow of energy. So you can't say, this is who I am, because by the time you finish the sentence, you're not that person anymore. And all of the thoughts that led you to say that have now created a new consciousness, what to speak of countless other factors. Maybe you've just in that instant ended a whole cycle of karma but don't know it. Maybe just in that instant you're just starting another. It's just nothing is fixed. So his comment was, if you're going to judge yourself, which I don't advise, he said you must judge yourself only by your aspirations, because your aspirations define the pathway your energy is going to take. And the pathway of your energy is really who you are, because that is the moving force. And any fixed point on that pathway isn't who you are, but the flow of energy. Insofar as we can be defined by anything, that's really who we are. That's, in the perspective I have now, which is, I would say, solidly in the fourth ashram, the fourth stage of life. I guess it takes 5 more years before I'm 75 to be solidly in the 100-year cycle in 4 pieces. But since I don't expect to live to be 100, I'll call it fourth ashram now. It's just, it all looks so different to me. And, naturally, I wish I could have not been so stupid earlier. It's just like, it would have been so nice not to have been so trapped in the delusion. And God knows I was doing my best. And I hope with all my heart, as you've heard me say many times, I want to be born an old woman. I sincerely want everyone around me to say, she was never a child. She was always an old woman. That would be exceedingly gratifying. I don't mean in the sense of debilitated and crabby, but in the sense of maintaining a certain detachment from what happens in this world and just really seeing that one incarnation is just a moment. And all you have to do is just keep your eyes on the goal and just let the rest of it roll over you. Now, the Gunas are part of this, because these 3 vibrations of energy which define the way the cosmos works really give us a way of evaluating ourselves that is not based on anything that we actually accomplish or don't accomplish. It's based entirely on the vibration of consciousness that we are putting out at the time, who we really are, what we're really doing. Swamiji gave me some very good advice when I was young, which I've also remembered, because I was very active and sometimes would get a little wound up. I at times went beyond my balanced energy. I've just been working on a project of costumes for our school play, and today was the first dress rehearsal, and I think today was the definition of just getting a little beyond yourself in terms of balanced energy. There's 75 children. There's probably about 150 costumes. I spent hours getting the whole thing organized in a certain way because they all have to change. Many have to change during the performance and so on. Everything that I planned turned out to be really, really bad ideas. So it was chaos. The play itself went beautifully. The costumes look fantastic. But backstage, it was a nightmare of just not being able to find things, not knowing who was supposed to be where. And there was no reason to be tense or upset. I mean, it was a costume rehearsal. That's what it was meant to be. And we had to stop the play once or twice because we were just completely out. But it was ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous. And I just felt I was just beyond myself. There was nothing I could do. The situation, I'd done my best, and my best had not turned out to be so good. And so it was just rolling waves of confusion that just were breaking over me and my wonderfully kind helpers and all those children. And we muddled through. You always just muddle through. Eventually everybody finds what. Nobody went on the stage in their underwear when it was just perfect. That's the definition of success. Just 1 year. I've been doing this, I've done this maybe 8 times or something. This was the second worst dress rehearsal I ever had. The first one, their costumes actually fell off. The play was set in India, and I was determined, don't ask me why, these are just like just the ideas you get. I was determined that I would actually put little saris on the children because I'd seen all these pictures of little children in adult Indian clothes. I didn't understand, which I now understand, that they're pinned in place, placed in front of the camera. The shot is taken because then the clothes fall off. Because saris are not held in place by strings and pins. They're held in place by the shape of a woman, which of course a little girl doesn't have. So you wrap that thing around her, and no matter how tight you squish it, it just falls off. I'm just in the mood to tell stories tonight. Okay. In the middle of that play, I also put some of the boys in dhotis, and I just did all this stuff. And this great kid, fortunately, he was a really great kid. So I had him in this dhoti, and I had pinned it in a certain way. And in that point in the play, the children all sit in the front of the auditorium it's really our sanctuary. They all have their chairs there. It's not a theater because we do it right in our church. So he was on this side of the room, the far side of the room, and I was against the wall on the other side, which is a substantial distance, maybe 20, 40 chairs, maybe between us. Maybe that's too many, but it's a lot. It was a lot of space. So I'm sitting there during the performance. We did things a little differently then, and I was sitting in the audience helping on the side. And I watched this kid on his belly. He's about a 13-year-old. And he starts slithering from his place, and he slithers behind all the students, and he slithers across the auditorium like this, and then he slithers up to where I'm sitting. And then he says, Asha, my legs are all caught in my costume, and I can't stand up. He said, and I have to go. And I have to go on stage in a couple of minutes. Unfortunately, he was such a great kid. He was just like, he wasn't upset, he wasn't crying. He recognized it was a problem, which he hoped I could solve. So, I had to crawl around there and find his legs and pull them out. Anyway, that was worse than today. Let's just put it like that. But it was a day when, and I will bring this back to the Gunas eventually, we still have time. It was a day when my energy moved away from where it should have been. So, the 3 gunas, which are described in the book, are very simple, really. There's what they call tamoguna, which moves us away from our connection to the divine. And I'll explain that in a minute. Then there's rajoguna, which is just activity. People use the phrase, and these are all words that are part of the Ananda culture. When I first moved away from Ananda village in 1980, beginning of 1987, Master's birthday is when I changed my address from Ananda village to Palo Alto. And we were introducing so many people to these teachings. And I realized over time, Ananda is an entire worldview and an entire culture, and there's many things that were accumulated meaningful that strangers don't know anything about. I mean, the oddest and the funniest one, Swami Kriyananda would often read us P.G. Wodehouse stories. He actually started reading us P.G. Wodehouse on Christmas Eve. Now we have such a solemn, sort of beautiful Christmas Eve. It's hard to think of sitting around Swami while he read us P.G. Wodehouse on Christmas Eve. But we have these parties, and it was social, and it was marvelous. And there's a P.G. Wodehouse story in which the character Birdie gets himself in a lot of trouble, and Jeeves is involved, but Birdie ends up having to give a lecture to a group of schoolgirls. And it's kind of a disaster for Birdie, and he starts telling bawdy jokes, or he's about to tell some bawdy jokes. P.G. Wodehouse is so clean that Birdie is just beginning. And the school marm, very powerful woman, suddenly realizes what's about to happen, and she stands up and interrupts him and says, "We will now sing the school song," as a way to shut Murti up. And ever since Swami started reading that story, every time things get really dicey, one of the things that people at Ananda will say is, "We'll now sing the school song," which is a way of trying to change the energy. And the first time someone said that, in company, that it just doesn't make any sense at all. And then all the people who are involved just start laughing. It's such a perfectly apt remark. But there are quite a number of more serious things that are just part of Ananda culture. And tamasic energy, rajasic energy, and sattvic energy are things that people will talk about. They'll say, "Oh, well, I didn't really enjoy it. It was too rajasic for me." Or I'm feeling so tamasic today. People rarely, they will comment about sattva, but it's more like we're complaining about rajo and tamo guna. Tamo guna is that which takes you away from your source. Rajasic energy is just activating. That's the best way to think about it. Rajasic energy is not either sattvic or tamasic inherently. It just depends on how it's being used. Energy is one of the 8 aspects of God. So it's necessary to be energetic. Your energetic can either be tamasic, which is to say you can use your energy to move you away from your attunement to the divine, or you can use your energy to move you closer to attunement with the divine, or you can use your energy to run in circles, which is when people say that something is just too rajasic for me. I had, in one of the Sunday services, I had made a rude remark about a man that I saw who had the logo of a professional basketball team tattooed on his calf. And the impression he gave me was that he was not a member of that team, nor had he ever been a member of that team. He was a fan, and he was such a fan that he had tattooed the logo on the back of his leg. I was not kind to him or respectful to him for having done that. He's a total stranger. I just saw him on the street. But it didn't inspire me, and I let that fact be known. And later, oddly, I felt rather bad about it. Just seemed unnecessary. So God gave me a very interesting lesson. A man came here to this house to repair one of the appliances. The refrigerator had a congenital defect, and we were in negotiation with its creator, trying to sort out who was going to solve the problem. So this repairman came, and he was close to the most restless person I've ever met. He's probably not the most restless person who ever lived, but he was close to one of the most restless I've ever met. He just, everything about him, he just had no point of center. He was just, he did his job perfectly well, but his speech, his movements, all like this, he was so rajasic. And I thought, this man needs to commit himself to a professional sports team. He needs to go to the games, and he needs to shout for his side, and he needs to direct all that energy towards something. And I just really saw, it's like wherever you're standing, you need to move. And he was so unfocused, but the idea of the man meditating was just, beyond even consideration. It's just like he needed to just keep moving with that rajasic energy until at least there was just some kind of a focus for it before he could begin to do anything else. So you have to look at these things. At least he was not tamasic in the sense of dull, but he was tamasic in the sense that, it means tamoguna has 2 aspects to it, which is important to understand. Tamoguna means that which is farthest away from your point of origin. So there's 2 ways to go tamasic. One way to go tamasic is to be so rajasic in an uncentered way that you're just moving very, very far away. Usually we think of tamasic as being dull. You just meet someone who has very little energy and not a lot of creative ideas and, just isn't much interested in doing anything. And you think of that person as tamasic, or oneself sort of just, you get used up and you don't have any more energy, and you feel rather tamasic because there's nothing happening. But you can also be very, very rajasic and that energy is moving in a tamasic direction, the point the farthest away from the source. And the sattvic energy is that which keeps you in touch, that causes you to move from your center point. Now, sattvic energy is very calm and very uplifted, but it by no means is it still. Sometimes we think of things as being sattvic because nothing is happening. But rajasic energy, activating energy can move us. It takes great willpower and it takes great energy to find God. And sometimes people think that they're being sattvic when they're actually being tamasic, in the sense that they're not putting out enough energy. Energy does not have to have an outward expression, but it still has to be present. One can be very still, but can be totally awake and aware. It need not have any outward manifestation, but nonetheless it's a state of extremely high energy. And it's a complicated issue that people go through, and this is a long time ago in this conversation, this hour, I was going to make this point that Swami gave me this advice. I started, but I didn't finish. He said to me at one point, you don't always accomplish more good, he said, simply by doing more. And that was just a very clear statement to me. And it was about the Gunas. He said, if you lose your magnetism, if your magnetism becomes merely rajasic and is not centered enough to have a sattvic quality to it, if you keep going, you're not going to create anything with the vibration that it needs to have success. It'll just be rajasic. So that's where he said you won't accomplish more good simply by doing more, because good is accomplished by sattvic magnetism. Because sattvic is what draws you and draws others closer to the source. And if you're not drawing people closer to the source, what is the point of doing it? So you can keep running around in circles and keep making things happen and just do all sorts of things, but you won't necessarily do more good, either more good for yourself or more good for the world. And in that case, one needs to, I gradually learned, pull back, say no, meditate more, be quiet, be more alone, whatever the issue might be. He, let me just get this for a moment here. Oh yes, a person's worst quality is almost always their best quality, carried just a little too far. It's a very interesting thing to use on yourself and on others. I would put that on my list of interesting points. It doesn't quite go up there with the karmic law, but it's just a very interesting side thing. Myself, I have great enthusiasm. And I have fun doing stuff. And I like to draw people into my enthusiasm. I'm just almost incapable of finding something that I really love and enjoy without immediately wanting to tell everyone about it. I just am enthusiastic. And of course, enthusiasm can get carried away. And I like to be involved in everything. I remember when, in the early years of Ananda, someone said something to me about, I think it wasn't a compliment, about the fact that I seemed to be involved in everything, or at least had an opinion about everything. My answer, I think the criticism was well-founded, more well-founded than I accepted. But the other side of it was, I felt like all of Ananda belonged to me. And I don't mean that belonged only to me, but I felt that everything about Ananda was of personal interest and concern to me. And if I didn't have direct responsibility, I felt an obligation to contribute if I had an idea that I thought was worth contributing. Now, there's my enthusiasm, perhaps carried just a little too far, because if people aren't asking, it's probably not a good idea to impose your thoughts. But it was a good thought that motivated me, which is I just wanted it all to succeed, and I wanted to give wherever I could give to it. But the result is you become too rajasic without being sattvic, because you're scattered in all directions. My best quality became my worst quality. So that's why Swami said to me, you won't do more good by doing more. So that was became my guideline. that when I began to feel my sense of peace and calmness thinning out, I needed to do something to bring it back. That didn't necessarily mean that I had to drop out, but I had to do something to bring it back. I mean, sometimes it's just as small as just taking 1 minute to recenter yourself. Several times in the course of today, I just had to take a minute or two just to center myself because it was just all spinning so far out of control. I just basically wanted to get in my car and drive away, and that just wasn't an option. One had to endure at least to the end of the rehearsal. But I did the dead bug pose a couple of times on the floor when there were no children in the room. I just lay on my back and just wondered if I could just dematerialize in the moment and not have to deal with it. And so one tries to recapture one's magnetism. Now, Swami, in this part of the book, he has this wonderful image that he spins for a long time because I remember he's so delighted by it. And this is the image of the waves on the ocean. And it's an interesting image because I guess the phrase they use now is counterintuitive. It just, where it doesn't immediately, he explains it differently than you would first anticipate that he was going to explain it. And what he's talking about is there's the great ocean of awareness and great souls, great saints. The reason they are great is because they are so connected to the vast ocean, if you're using that as an image. But in being so connected to the vast ocean, often they loom large, in the field of human endeavor and in the consciousness of those who are attuned to them. I remember literally the first time I met Swami Kriyananda was in that tent outside Stanford University in November of 1969. And he walked into the room, and I was some distance from him. It wasn't a very large room, but I was about as far away from him as I could be. I was against the far wall from the door. He walked into the door, and his consciousness immediately just came right to me, that his aura was just so enormous that it distance, time, space, distance, everything. That was just a visual impression. He hadn't said a word. It was just the first time I laid eyes on him, there was this sense of immensity about him, which continues to the present day. He was just always immense. I think immense is a word I like at the moment. That was what he was like. He was so much bigger than anything or anyone. So if you're going to talk about the ocean and its waves, you would naturally think that the saints were like tsunamis, great, tremendous tidal waves. But the image is exactly backwards, because the saint is right at the ocean, but is permeating out to the whole ocean. So the largeness is his connectedness to the source. Because all waves are manifestation from the ocean. I mean, that's what a wave is. Here's the whole ocean, and a wave rises up like this. And it's nothing but the ocean, but it can appear, you have to think of it kind of like a little painting of the waves separate. It can appear to be its own entity, but really it's nothing but the water that assumes that particular shape. And as Swami describes it, that's been whipped into that particular shape by the restless currents of wind or the driving inner urge to separate oneself from the vast ocean and to stand alone, different from all the others. So it's actually the most egoic that rises up like that. And in that sense, even though activated by the Rajasic energy, the higher the wave, the more tamasic it is, which is ironic in a sense, isn't it? Now, we're not talking about in the eyes of the world. We're talking about inner consciousness, because in the eyes of the world, these great masters do loom enormously large. I mean, no matter what field a person is in, no matter how magnificent he or she may be in their profession or their art, the influence of the masters through the ages just far transcends, I mean, even the greatest of others. We still remember Shakespeare and Bach and Mozart and Michelangelo. It's not like these people disappear. But in terms of the transforming power on the planet, Buddha, Krishna, Jesus, and in time, Paramahansa Yogananda will prove to be such a one. I mean, that's where the power really comes from. So they do loom large, but they loom large because they connect us with this vast ocean. When Swami Kriyananda died, he died April 21st, 2013. You know, the spring season has become the Mahasamadhi season. March 7th is Yogananda's Mahasamadhi, the day final conscious exit from the body. March 7th is Yogananda. March 9th, today, is Sri Yukteswar's Mahasamadhi. Easter always comes around this time, so that's the time that Jesus left. This year it's April 1st. And then April 21st now is Moksha Day for Swami Kriyananda. So it's sort of a little season. I feel like in a higher age, which may come very quickly, but in a higher age, like this season of the passing of all of these great souls, and the wonderful little period of time in September, from September 26th, which is the Mahasamadhi of Lahiri, and September 30th, which is his birthday. That'll probably like become Kriya Yoga Week or something like that. When I transferred from Ananda village after 16 years, and the first year or two I was living here, and mail, remember mail? That's where the man delivers them, and it comes in your little box, and it's mostly paper. When mail was when it was January 5th and March 7th and May 19th, Swami's birthday, and the mail would still be delivered and the banks would still be open. It was just like, it was odd to me. I'd been so many years in an ashram environment where everything ordinary stopped on those days. And it was delightful, but a little disconcerting to realize that all of these people didn't seem to know that this was not a business as usual day. And I got used to it, of course. I mean, it sounds quaint to say it now, but it was really in my psyche very deeply. That's the great glory of ashram life, is that you actually really do get to just live in a God-centered reality, and you don't really have to pay attention to much else. But I imagine a time and place in a higher age when it's a more sattvic yuga, and people just naturally want to focus in on these kinds of celebrations. So in any case, I was saying when Swami Kriyananda died on April 21st, he died without any warning, except for the fact that he was almost 87, and he'd been very ill for a very long time. Or let me phrase it differently. His body was just greatly debilitated. When he would sit down, it was like, and he didn't have to really do anything with his body except just speak through it. His face became like a child, and his energy was magnificent. But if he had to even get up from the chair or move across the room or do anything with that body, by the end, he had 2 people with him almost all the time. So we certainly had no reason to be surprised when he passed, but there was no warning. In my mind, for some reason, I always thought that we would know when he was going to die, and that, we would all go to wherever he was and would be there with him for his last whatever days, weeks, whatever it was, even for the last 10 years before his passing. I always kept my passport really ready, and when I finally had to renew my passport, I knew I was being foolish, but I spent like $300 to renew it in like 48 hours or 24 hours, whatever it was. I absolutely could not bear the thought that if Swami died and I didn't have my passport. And then even then, I knew exactly where it was and that I could go and get it if I had to, because I couldn't bear that. But in any case, I got a call at 11 at night that he was having trouble breathing, and 5 minutes later, I got a call that he was passed. So there was no interlude. And that's exactly what happened. He got up in the morning. He was in Italy. He got up in the morning and had a seizure, and his heart stopped, and he stopped breathing. There was a little bit of a kerfuffle, but within 15 minutes he was gone, or 10 minutes even. So there it was, and all of a sudden that which we have always anticipated had actually happened. And many of us flew to Italy, and there was a service over there, and I was just trying to feel it from his point of view. I was all too familiar with what it felt like from my point of view, so I thought I would try to feel it from his point of view. And the image that came to me was exactly this, of the ocean, this vast ocean that had always been his consciousness, and that he had raised, and this is how Swami talks about it here, that the Master raises his energy above the level of the ocean just as much as is needed to create a perceivable individuality. Because they have to be able to be perceived. They take a body, they move in it, it gradually ages, it goes through experiences, it has a personality. All of it is, I used to be rather glib about explaining all of it, but it's all a great mystery to me. But there's the ocean, and then there's this little tiny bulge. And from our point of view, Kriyananda was that bulge. I mean, we all had some sense of all of this consciousness that was really him, but it was that little tiny bulge, that marvelous personality. He was so entertaining. He was so funny. He was just such a joy. When I was just saying a few days ago, it's just like whenever you were with him, whenever I was with him, I'll speak for myself. It's just like I didn't care where we were. I didn't care what happened. I didn't care what we did. I forgot about everything else. Just nothing else had any priority. I had to tell people when Swami's in the room, don't try to get my attention. I just can't give it to you. I can't talk to you about anything. I can't turn my attention away. I just can't do it. I'm happy to talk to you later, but I can't turn my attention away now. Don't imagine for a moment that I was in some cosmic state. I certainly wasn't, but I just couldn't turn my attention away. But that whole thing was just that, just the Kriyananda right there. And I wasn't obsessed with his personality, and what attracted me, of course, was all of this. But when he was there, he was really there. He was so present through that body. And so there was so much reality to that tiny little bulge. Another way of putting it is just like, here's the flat ocean, and Swami opened this tiny little triangle, and then the ocean flowed out through that triangle. And when he stopped breathing, that tiny little flap just closed. And from his point of view, really, I think very little happened. From our point of view, there was just this huge shift of energy, but he lived so close to the ocean that when he just stopped breathing and let that tiny little bulge just melt back. We were having Master's Mahasamadhi 2 nights ago here in Palo Alto, where we celebrated. And Master died in the middle of a big public event at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. There was some 100 or 2 people in the room. It was a big event honoring the ambassador from India, which in 1952, considering that India became its own country in 1948, it's interesting to realize this was a huge thing for an Indian man to be the national representative of that country, because prior to that time, the English had represented India, but they had stood for India, and now an Indian man was representing India. So Swamiji Master was embracing that. And so there's this tremendous celebration at the Biltmore, and it's just a very big occasion. And Master stands up, and he gives this beautiful speech about India and America. He recites this poem he's written called My India. He recites the last line, my body is hallowed. I am hallowed. My body touched that sod, referring to the land of India. This body was born and grew up there, and that makes me holy just because of that. It's a beautiful poetic articulation of his heart's love for that country. He said sod, as Swami described it, who was there, a long exhalation, and that was it. And then he fell over. He was gone, just like that. You know, this tiny little opening, and then it just, you know, even like he did it so softly, with that soft word and that soft exhalation. That's the word I'm trying to say. You know, that's sattvic. But it's not still outwardly, but it's never separated from that great ocean of spirit. So you can be extremely active, extremely creative. Swamiji, in fact, later in this book, he talks about the fact, I've always known intuitively that you had to do things really, really well. But Vedanta sort of undermines that a little bit. It's like it's all a dream. What does it matter in the end? You know, you can get kind of confused. But I always knew it was necessary to just keep at it until it was as good as you could possibly do it. And believe me, Swami Kriyananda exemplified that and demanded of us that we do our best. He knew what a person was capable of, and he was not willing to accept less. I myself went through a multiple decade cycle of him demanding of me that I learn how to write, which thank God he never gave up. And thank God I never gave up, because I actually did learn. But it's because most of the time our unwillingness to give a situation the very best of which we are capable is because Tamo-guna takes us over. That a certain dullness, a certain unwillingness. Now, Tamo-guna is that which takes us away from our spiritual source. Fear, laziness, concern about what other people think, hypercritical attitude. I mean, just make a long list. My difficulty writing was primarily because I had a very critical nature, which I directed outwardly, but it became such a habit that when I tried to be creative, I directed it inwardly. Extremely tamasic quality, not low energy, not at all low energy, but very tamasic. And so usually what holds us back is the fact that we are not in harmony with the gunas. And that's really the template. You just apply, sattvic energy takes us closer to source. And just to finish this thought, because I'm running out of time, when you do really creative work of a certain intuitive kind, and you gradually learn what the difference is, you feel your relationship to source. And that's what's happening. You can be very active, but you're becoming very sattvic, because your wave is not extending out from the ocean, it's merging in to the great ocean. It's marvelous quality. Well, much more could be said and will be said, but not tonight. So God bless you. Thank you for joining.